Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we are sitting down with a brand new guest, someone who I have been friends with for a long time on social media. Her name is Ally Markotich, and she is a very talented artist who is releasing a brand new book into the world. The book is called Soul Kindling, Ignite Your Sacred Creative Heart. And so, Ally, welcome to the podcast. Long overdue, but I'm
Oh
excited you're
my
here.
gosh. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Glenn. I just want to first, I just want to say I'm such a huge fan of your work, and I've been listening to your podcast since I found, since we kind of first connected. And it's like so much of your story resonates for me. And I just have been so looking forward to this. And thank you for just doing this work in the world because I'm thankful that you just have a way to be able to give people a way to share their story and their voice. And kind of some of us who are on the fringe doing
Mm.
kind of fringe work, you make space for us. So,
Thank you. Well, you've reached out to me a number of times with encouraging words, and I have to say that your encouraging words seem to come at the time when I feel like I need it the most, because
ah,
there's been so many times where I'm sure we'll talk about it. You feel like giving up on your creative work for whatever
oh
reason it
my
might
gosh.
be. And then lo and behold, there'll be a DM from you saying, I listened to this, or, thank you for this. And it's just, I'm like, that's what I needed. So thank you for sending those
Yeah,
messages.
no problem.
All right, so before we get into the book, can you maybe tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and who are you? What do you do? Maybe some of your faith journey, whatever you think we need to know, let us in.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, my creative work is it's like a mix of different things, but
Mhm.
it's art and it's writing, and then a lot of the work I do with people is guiding people back to themselves as, remembering themselves as sacred and creative through creative practice and through creativity as a spiritual practice, I would say.
Mm.
So, kind of loosening up that idea that creative endeavors have to look a certain way or they have to produce something that is functional, and instead to kind of engage with creativity as a way to just really be with divine love and kind of see what, surfaces from that.
Yeah, I love that. The book, obviously, a lot of that comes through in the book, and so I'm curious, like, why this book? Where did this book? Obviously, when our listeners, if you get this book, you're immediately going to see like this is not like your typical book, because I can just show on the screen there's lots of poems in here, but then Allie also has lots of her paintings and her
Yeah.
art in here, which is so beautiful. So this is a very unique book, and I'm curious, like, where did this come from? Where did this get birthed from? What was this spark of
Yeah.
the idea? What
Oh my
happened?
gosh. Yeah, what happened? Well, I mean, number one, it's like it's kind of a book that has been years in the making. So it
hmm
definitely wasn't like I sat down and said, I'm going to make a book and it's going to be about this, this, and this. It
Which
was
a lot of
more,
people think happened. A lot of people think, oh, you
right.
just must just think one day you're gonna write a book and you do it. Nope.
No,
Not
exactly.
really.
I mean, it was very organic.
Mhm.
It was there was a time in my life when I was kind of falling away from traditional church life and really asking a lot of those questions that you
Mhm.
have kind of navigated. And it led me back to it led me into contemplative practice, but it
Mhm.
also led me back into I grew up Roman Catholic, and so in my Roman Catholic, days, you just learned as a kid certain stories about the monks and the mystics, and people like Julian of Norwich, who, is all shall be well and all shall be well and all matter of things shall be well. It's like there's these things that kind of stay in your heart. And, those were the things that I was kind of coming back to a few years
Mm.
ago. And it eventually just led me back into my own creativity. So I started to do poetry and I started to do my drawing, and that journey, it was like there was a time where I was really saying, who am I? That question, that like it's almost like this timeless question of I wanted to release a lot of the labels that,
Mhm.
when you first meet people, they say, what do you do? And sometimes I didn't want that. I was like, I knew I was more than what I did,
Yeah.
or but I always felt like I had to prove what I did in order to be worthy in certain circles. And anyways, so that part of the journey just kind of started there, and led me to create this content. And a few years, probably about 2 years ago, I really sat down with it and just looked at all of it and was like, what are the themes that I've been
Hmm.
circling around? What has really been bubbling and stirring within me? And that's when I kind of started to structure and go, okay, oh, these are poems of identity. These are poems of pilgrimage. These are poems where I'm really just speaking about that the burst of joy and imagination that happens when you really kind of come back and start to create again. And then, of course, the sacred feminine who kind of found me along the way. Um, and then I will just also just add that the art, sometimes the art came first. I would draw something, and then because there was an image that kind of came forth, then the poem would follow it. So there are certain poems and art in the book where like I know they go together. They might not be side by side in the book, but it's like I'm like, oh,
Hmm.
that first happened and then this came with it. So
Yeah, that's so good. In the book, you talk about how the way you kind of phrase it is that the book is and I might say this incorrectly, so correct me if I am wrong, but bring us back to the treasure, bring us back to the spark that we've been separated from, we've maybe forgotten about in our life. And I was wondering, like, you just kind of gave us a teaser there, but can you talk to us more about like what that spark is that you're trying to bring us back to, what that treasure is, and like what does that look like for the average listener,
yeah,
the average person who maybe they're not tapped into their creativity at all,
yeah,
or yet, they're working a nine to
yeah.
five job, trying
Uh,
to pay the bills, pay the mortgage and raise the kids, all the different things. Like, what does that spark look like for everybody?
Yeah, and I think like this is something that I'm there's kind of this new awareness for me even recently, which is that creativity is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a hobby. It doesn't
Hmm.
have to be something you put aside where you're like, oh, I'm going to spend an hour creating and then people say, well, I don't have the time to do that, but it's more like there's this creative thread that I think runs through every day. And part of the practice is coming back to the observation of
Hmm.
where that creative thread is through your life. And we're always creating. I mean, we're creating with our words. We're creating when we speak to one another. We're creating when we wake up and get out of bed and decide what we're going to choose to wear. And there's
Hmm.
all of these little choices along the way throughout our days where when we start to really wake up to ourselves as creators, we start to craft our lives and maybe a little bit differently or with a little bit more of intention. And when we start to connect with the creation around us, that too can inform us as creators. And I really, from a spiritual perspective, I go back to Genesis 1 in the beginning, and the very first verb is God created.
Hmm.
And then we're made in the image of that creator. So I just go, well, how can we, if we're made in the image of, then how can we not say that we are not creators where every single one of us is?
Yeah.
And that's, to me, that's the rethreading of we have to come back to that truth for ourselves in some way.
Yeah. It's funny when I was making my way through the book, I was thinking about my own journey and how I've always been drawn to like create things. Doesn't matter what it is. Like
Yeah.
when I was a kid, I loved Legos, right? I loved just to create things. I loved even more than getting like a kit. I loved just getting a box of Legos and just making something on
Yeah.
my own. I love to do that. I would always carry around a sketch pad when I was a kid. I was always drawing. I was always doing
Yeah.
colored pencils and paint and everything like that. Then, I got older and I went to seminary, I pastored a church, and even in the church, like I loved creating sermon series for whatever reason. That
Yeah.
just like made me so happy to put together like a fun series. And I loved putting together like the Bible lessons and stuff like that. I hated meetings. I hated meeting with people. Like I loved just to kind of be in my own little space doing my thing. And then I got to Apple. I worked there for 11 years in a retail store. And I really felt like I started to lose myself because I remember feeling like so trapped in
Mm,
this place. And then halfway in, like maybe 6, 7 years in, I got to work on the business team and I was literally sitting at a desk all day
Oh,
talking on the
yeah.
phone. And I was like, I don't like this. It's paying the bills and you
Yeah.
have health insurance, you have benefits, and after 11 years of having that, it becomes very comfortable to have that, and then you
Yep.
get straight to,
Yep.
well, I can't leave this because then what am I going to do? And so then when I remember when I was there, I started the podcast and I was like, I love doing this. But then I felt like my life was divided because I had like my podcast and creative self over here,
Yes.
but then I had my serious Apple
Yes.
person over here. And it
Yes.
was hard to live like those two lives. But then I was like, well, what if I could merge these two things together? So I started to bring my books that I would read, for a podcast
Yeah.
interview with me to work. I keep it on my desk so I could see it during the day, help me remember this is
Yeah.
who I am, and I can bring that with me to work. And
Yeah.
for whatever reason, it kind of enlivened my conversations I was having with people. And people would stop by the desk, ask me what the book is about. We get to talk about the book. I was like, this is cool. And then they had me, do a newsletter for the store. So I would put together a newsletter, with
Yeah.
Canva and everything like that. And I was like, oh, I get
Yep.
to create this thing. And people were like, this is the coolest newsletter ever. And I'm like, I'm just having fun with it, just putting in these stupid little things in there, just having a lot of fun with it. And then Alexander Shai, Alexander,
Yeah.
we had connected on the podcast and he tapped me on the shoulder and said, can you make me a couple images for something? So I started to do that. But what I'm saying is that like in the midst of that Apple world, I was still able to kind of tap into my creativity, even if on the outside it didn't seem like I would be able to do that. And I think that keeping that
Yes.
spark alive
Yes.
in there was so important for me because it didn't get snuffed out. It was still there. I just had to breathe life into it.
Oh my gosh, it's so true. It's so good what you just shared, and it's also like I think that when you just choose to live a little bit more into it, all of a sudden people do start to notice, and then doors do start to open,
Yeah.
and different kinds of conversations start to happen. And it's like as long as you're keeping everything closed in and it's like this separate thing that you only do, and that's what I used to do a long time ago, is like I would only keep, like, creativity was almost like a luxury for me. Like, oh,
Yeah.
I have to keep it for only special times. I only can do it, once the kids are in bed. And, I mean, just kind of like it had to be this little pocket.
Yep.
And the more that I just allowed myself to stream into it on a regular basis, the more it just, everything just started to open up.
Yeah. You have this one quote in the book, and you say, evoking the still small voice within
Mm.
that's been quieted by a journey of making safe decisions, attending to the needs of others, and caving to the pressure to please. And I felt like when I read that, I was like, they talk about getting somebody. I was like, man, she gets me because I feel like that's been me like for so long. And even now, like I've, dove back into my own art journey with my own painting
Yes,
and drawing and stuff
yes,
like that.
love
And for
it.
the longest time, like I didn't do that because I was like, it's a waste of my time. And I also had people in my life who told me that it wasn't good enough to do anything with it. So I just stuffed it away
Yeah,
to make safe decisions. Like I'm gonna work
right.
at Apple and I'm gonna do this thing and the needs of others. You have
Yeah,
family, you have kids you gotta take care of and caving to the pressure to please, because if I do these other things that other people can see and I'm really good at and it's making me money, blah blah blah, that's pleasing people and there's that falls into it. So I
yes.
just felt like when I read that, I was like, yes, like that's what
Yeah.
it's all about.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's like I just want to like encourage that with you, because it's like I've seen the work that you create. It's awesome. It's so I mean, to me it's just like spark of the inner child whenever
Mm.
I see the stuff that you post on Instagram. And your daughter is seeing you. And I think that that's been one of the things for me in my own family life, is like my kids have seen my journey. Like I've
Mhm.
modeled this thing. And, now my son who's 18, and my son who's 16, they both are just, they're finding their creative way in the world. And it's really, I think like that's the thing, is coming back to ourselves as creatives and creators. It starts to, it overflows into our own whether it's our family life, into our community. And it's like I used to sit in meetings or, gatherings or, organizational type things. And now it's like I just think to myself, gosh, there are so many ways to make a meeting so much more fun, so much
Yes.
more playful. And I'm like, where are the creatives in the organizations that can really start to amplify some creative practice within, because I've always thought, well, everything flows downward. So if you get your leadership to really like start to do creative things at the top levels, of course it's gonna start to flow downward, but people have to be willing to try. And when you have a lot of times organizations are more linear, they're not necessarily connected in with their own creative verve. They don't
Yep.
want to.
Yep.
So
That's
you
right.
know
And
how it
then,
is. Yeah.
yeah, then you have the leader or the manager, whatever, who feels that they have to run the meeting when in reality, like you have people who are working around you who maybe are really good at things that you're not good at. So,
Yeah.
why can't you bring a music element into the meeting if you have a
Right.
musician? If you have
That's
an
right.
artist, why can't you bring an artistic element into the
Right.
meeting if you have an artist? Like, it would be so cool to, like, what if you did the meeting and you had your artist drawing off to the side, whatever was going on in the meeting, and
Yes.
then that became like
Yes.
the template for what the meeting was about that you could hang in the back and it can inspire people. Like, cool things like
Yes.
that could just bring so much more life and energy into the average, dull, boring workplace that we all dread.
Oh my gosh, I totally agree with you. And also, I just think to myself, when you start to bring everybody in to just do a little something, it also releases the leader from having to carry the whole thing. So
That's
it
right.
models more of a circle. It just models more of a circular way. And
That's
I,
right.
you know, I, so, and, oftentimes, like, I think that's the voice of the voice of the artist, the voice of the creative is not always welcome because there's there's not the shift doesn't want to happen. It
That's
just
right.
wants to keep going the way that it is. But
Yeah.
I think that there are such beautiful ways and ideas to bring creativity into our spaces that could really ignite things in a
Yeah.
really cool way.
I was thinking too, I mean, I feel like this whole discussion about like rediscovering your spark, your treasure, your true self. I feel like that's for those of us who follow the Christian path. Like for me, that's what salvation has become
Mhm.
all about, right? Because
Yeah.
like in my upbringing, salvation was, you're a sinner, God is mad at your sin, it's got to be punished, so Jesus kind of took it on the chin for you, and if you believe that, you get to go to heaven, when you die, and that was salvation. And
Yeah.
then when I abandoned like that whole storyline, I was like, well, I don't know what to do with this Jesus guy
Yeah.
anymore, and then I came across Alexander Shaya and his work and
Yes.
people like
Yes.
Richard
Love
Rohr and some
him.
other
Yeah.
people, and I realized like, oh, like what if salvation is about like waking up and remembering? Like what if
Oh,
Jesus is like
yes.
God's mirror saying to you, this guy right here, this is who you really are. And if you could just
Yes.
wake up and remember that and live from that place that is deep within you, you could change the whole world. And I feel like that's what
Yeah.
salvation for me has become. So this talk about the spark, the inner child, the treasure, the true self, I feel like that's spot on with salvation.
Oh man. So yeah, so good. And I want Richard Rohr, if you Google, he has this one article on the Center for Action and Contemplation. He turns atonement into at one-ment. And
Mm,
it's this beautiful article all about, that salvation as being coming back and connecting with God, that,
yeah.
that Christ is love, and it's just Christ is an outpouring of love. And to me, I'm like, that's what I often just think is, if we can reconnect and receive that love that already lives within us. I mean, we were talking about the critic prior to getting on here, but it's like
Mhm.
the critic oftentimes, it wants to separate us out and separate us away from that love. And oftentimes we're hardest on ourselves. I mean,
Mhm.
if we catch our thoughts sometimes at ourselves, that can be the hardest voice to encounter. And so if we can really steep and receive the love of God, I just think that that can be so transformational, coming back to ourselves and coming back to the treasure that we are.
Yeah. I think that's, I think realizing in the moment that you're not living from that place is the key, right? Because you can
Yeah.
wake up in the moment, then you can begin again and you can make a different
Yes.
decision. And we're learning that now with our daughter because she's 7. And so
Mm,
she's in this place where she has very big emotions. And so
yeah.
sometimes those emotions they just overflow, whether they're anger or they're
Yeah.
sadness, whatever it is, especially when it comes to being angry about something, she'll kind of have this like explosion. Then when we're all done, she'll say, I'm such a bad kid. Like I messed up. And I say to her, it's not about, you're not a bad kid. You might
Yeah.
have made a bad choice in the moment, but here you are, and you've realized that you made the bad choice. And now you
Yeah.
can choose next time to make a different choice. And she's beginning to like wake up in the moment. Like even the other night, she was getting upset about something and she stopped. She caught herself
Mm,
and she took a deep breath, and I could
mm,
see the expression on her face. And she stopped and she made a different choice. And I said,
yeah.
that's you remembering who you are. I said, deep down inside,
Right.
that's not your true reaction. I said, but you're reacting that way in the moment, but now you're remembering who you are and you can make a different decision. And she says, just like Jesus, right? Like I'm remembering
Yeah.
that I'm just like Jesus. I'm like, exactly. That's exactly what it is.
That's exact right, exactly. And I mean, and it, sometimes like if sometimes like if my critic, or even if I'm just wrestling with an emotion, I mean, I will draw it and make it into like a little character for myself. So that's
Mm,
like a fun thing
I
that you
love
can
that.
do with a kid, is to have, have them draw. Like a lot of times, like if I'm like even working with myself, like if I'm really feeling, in deep dislike of something, if I'm in critic mode, just drawing a picture of what that critic looks like, letting it say what it wants to say, but then drawing that thread of love like through the critic, and then seeing what shift happens when you thread through love through your little critic character. It can be a fun way to just work visually, and sometimes like the visual is so powerful to work with in an intentional way, because you really get to see what it is you're holding.
That's right.
And it's like it just can become such a potent way for our own meditations and reflections in life.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. You told us a little earlier about like a little bit of your story. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about like what it's looked like for you to, I guess, discover that you lost the spark, maybe,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then what you did with that realization, and then like what it looked like for you to kind of find the spark again and live from that place. Because again, looking at this
Yeah.
book, your poetry, your art, clearly you're living from that place. So what was that process of discovery like for you?
Yeah, I mean, well, and it's like I would say that like I grew up very like connected to myself as an artsy kind of creative person. Like similar to you, it's like I was always drawn towards two-dimensional drawing, coloring, painting, all of those kinds of things, and that was really like a safe haven for me. And also writing. I always had a journal when I was young, so those things were very foundational for
Hmm.
me. um and spiritually, the the Roman Catholic Church was, I loved the like I have very positive like recollection of the Roman Catholic Church as a young child, because it was so kinesthetic. It's like
Hmm.
you walk in, you touch holy water, there's beautiful stained glass around, like it smells really good. There's,
Hmm.
a lot of silence. So all of those things just kind of were a foundation for me. But I would say it was probably in my 20s when, it was like after art school. Art school was hard. There's just a lot of critiques and criticism, and you compare yourself to everybody. It's just that, and also I did start to just have questions around my faith in a deeper way, which I think is very natural when you're
Hmm.
in your early 20s. You start to really kind of, everything starts to dissolve a little bit, and I struggled that women could not be, up front in the Catholic Church. I mean, they could if they were singing or reading, doing a reading, but
Certain
there's,
things.
certain things. But in order to give the message or that sort of a thing, that was like not allowed. So,
Mhm.
um, so that was part of the falling away from both of my creativity and my spirituality. And then coming back was a very long, slow process. I mean, it was probably when I had kids, I first started to come back spiritually, just because I wanted them to know God. I wanted to model that in some way. I felt like there was one of the things in the Catholic Church for me was that God always felt very distant, and
Mhm.
I knew that there was more of a personal like God of love, and I really wanted my kids to experience that. And so, initially it's just funny because it's like I did have a lot of evangelical friends back in my early days as a young mom. And what was so appealing about the evangelical faith is like their certainty on everything. And at
Yes.
that time, I needed certainty. It's like
Yep.
I wanted to know, I had questions, and they could give me
Hmm.
the answers.
Yep.
But, I think also naturally that just especially as an artist, because my worldview was just always very wide. It's like I always had a wide worldview on religions and faiths and all that kind of stuff. There was just a lot that started to I started to go, this isn't holding.
Hmm.
This one answer isn't holding. This one right way, this one right path that's not really setting right
Yeah.
within my heart. And those questions, just really listening to my own questions and continuing to follow the path, um it led me back to it led me to the Presbyterian Church, the PCA Church, and or PCUSA, I would say, not the PCA Church. um so there's a difference there. But it's just a very grace giving, open, church that was very I was able to ask my questions,
Yeah.
and had a mentor who said, why don't you look at spiritual formation? And it was the spiritual formation that it was taking the coursework in contemplative studies that really was like, oh, the silence, oh, the Lectio Divina, oh, creativity can be a prayer.
Mm.
And that was ultimately what really kind of guided my way back. And it's just like I said to you before, it's like all those little lights along the path. It was like just continuing to follow them, like following where my heart expanded, the people that were like giving the messages that I was like, that really rings true. Like not just in my head, but in like the whole of my being. So
Yeah.
people like, Rob Bell, and I mean, Richard Rohr or Alexander John Shire. I mean, these people who have just done such great work in the world, they they just have had such a profound impact on my own faith walk. And then, of course, my artist teacher, Shiloh Sophia, I mean, her work was also just extremely expansive for me in working with creativity in a really intentional way. And there was a point that I got to before I really started working with her and the work that she does. It was like I had kind of like this little opening, like I know there is a way to take creativity deeper. I
Mm.
know that there's a way to kind of like listen in, working with it to listen into my own inner wisdom, but
Mm.
I just couldn't, I didn't know how, and I didn't know who was going to teach me. And then and then again, like it was like one of those, oh, the door opened and there she was, and I was like, oh, and I worked with her for many years, and it was just such a profound experience to,
Mm.
be under her wisdom as well. So,
Mm. It sounds like, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like, I mean, art has been with you on your faith journey, right? So as you've evolved, your art has
yes.
evolved. You met this
Yes.
person who didn't maybe so much teach you something as much as maybe opened you up to see what was within you all along, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Would that be an accurate way
ev
to say it?
yeah, I mean, art has I think like my creativity has always come out in different ways.
Yeah,
I think it wasn't always through drawing and painting. I think there were times when I would throw a party and that was my way to
right.
like, express my creativity or whatever. But I mean, but ultimately there's always been this kind of thread of expression
hmm
that has been important to me.
Yeah, I love that. What about the critic now? We've talked about the critic a little bit, but whenever it comes to creative work of any kind, right, there's the critic
Oh,
inside who loves to peek his head and start chattering away. Your work
yeah.
isn't good enough. You shouldn't spend so much time doing
Uh,
that. Time is money.
yeah.
You
Oh
got you
my
got
gosh.
you're not gonna make very much wasting your
Yeah.
time on this. No, you have no right to do this. It's dumb. You're wasting your time. Blah blah blah. Where does that voice come from? Because I even see it like already in my daughter. She's 7,
Yeah. Yeah.
and like I've never said anything like that to her. Nobody
Right.
has. But
Right.
those it still peaks up in there. So I'm curious, like
Oh
what
man.
have been your findings about the critic? Where does it come up? How do you deal with it? Take us into that.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I think first of all, like what you're saying, like just the awareness, like first you have to be, because I think some people don't even realize they have it. Like it's almost like it's a running tape and they don't
Yeah.
realize that
You
there's a
assume
running
it's you.
tape.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
It's just like, so first is like starting to catch it, like,
Mm,
oh, like, oh, I do tell myself that. And I think that like, again, it's kind of like, you know, I think I'm still in the process of catching that for myself or seeing where that what those stories are for myself that are limiting, the limiting kind of those limiting beliefs, those limiting stories. I definitely am a recovering perfectionist, and I think like the art in my book is it is a very loose style because that is this I think like that's the style that has developed for me since engaging with creativity more as a spiritual practice
hmm
instead of as a way to make something pretty that has to look a certain way.
Yeah.
And I think that that has been a real release for me.
hmm
There was a period of time where um I stayed away from doing a lot of drawing because I wanted it to be perfect. Or if I was copying an image, sometimes you take a photograph or you take a magazine image and you're trying to kind of like work with it. If it didn't look exact, I'd be throwing it in the garbage, I'd be crumpling up things, all of those things that I think that we can do to ourselves. And I really just had to I think when there was a painting that I did, and it was before I did any work with Shiloh. It was kind of like it was a period of time when I was coming to my creative practice as a prayer.
mm
And I was working on this painting, and I just had this aha, like, oh, it's all about the process. The process is the relationship with divine love. And once that kind of came to me, I was like, oh, so it doesn't have to look perfect. It doesn't have to be necessarily beautiful or whatever. So but of course, I still have that propensity to want things to look beautiful, to want it to be pretty. And so it's like a ebb and flow. I mean, it's like with the perfectionist, I mean, it's like I just kind of consider her as a part of my persona to a certain degree. And
mm.
sometimes I'm like, okay, like you're gonna clean up the art room today and give her like something like where she can be really efficient at it, and that's good.
Yeah. Give her a job, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, I've been noticing for me, like and Alexander was a big help for me in this because coming from my evangelical world, I mean, I grew up, I always had trouble with self-doubt,
Yeah.
self-criticism, condemnation, all these different things. And coming from the evangelical world, I was told that's a demon, right? That you have to
Oh,
have
yes.
cast out of your life. And so, I can't tell you how many deliverance sessions I've been part of where I've had oil sprinkled on me and people praying, a circle of people, and me weeping in the middle, and I feel like I'm free of this thing. And a couple weeks go by and I'm feeling good, but then all of a sudden, it starts chattering away again. So I was sharing this with Alexander, and he said, what if that's not a demon? And he's like, it's not. But he's like, what? Just think about it for a minute. What if it's not a demon? He said, what if that's, your inner child? And what if that's a
Mm,
smaller version of you
yeah.
who's chattering back at you the things that he's been told when he was younger?
Ah.
And he said, what if you stopped doing to that voice what was always done to it growing up, which is screaming at it,
Oh,
telling it to
yeah.
go away, locking it away? And he said, what if you invited that? What if you envisioned that voice being like Jordan, my daughter, and you having her come up on your
Oh,
knee and speak to that voice, what it was longing to be spoken to when it was younger? And I was like, man, how have I been through years of school and nobody's ever told me that?
yeah.
Like how in the
Yeah,
world did I get to this
exactly.
point in my life and I've never been told that? But that was like a life-changing thing for me because now I no longer try to shut the voice up, I spent a lot more time talking to it and trying
Mm,
to befriend it and trying to understand it. And I
so
feel like
beautiful.
that's been part of the reason why this whole art journey has unlocked for me is because that little person loved art, but
Yeah.
he was jammed away for a long
Uh-uh.
time. And now that I've let him out, we still critique the art because he still wants it to be perfect, but we have a lot of fun with it together. And I feel like that's just been
Yes.
such a huge thing for me to realize that the critic I don't need to get rid of the critic. The critic can be a friend and we can make something together. So,
It's so great, right? It reminds me of that Rilke poem about, welcoming the guest house,
yeah.
welcoming it all in and listening to what each, what each one comes in and has to say. And
Yep.
I think that is a beautiful share from that Alexander John Shaya mentioned to
Yeah.
you. I mean, for sure.
Yeah, he's like the Uncle Alexander of the podcast.
Yeah, for sure.
He's been here like 85 times. All right, last question for you. Do you have time for one more question?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Okay,
sure.
cool. So you've already mentioned the divine feminine, and you
Yep.
talk in the book about like MotherGod, and you
Yeah.
consistently use she instead of he. And I was wondering if you could talk to me more about that, because I think your wisdom here will be really helpful for those of us who are raised in a
Yeah.
more fundamentalist, especially evangelical setting where, God is a white male. He's got
Yeah.
blonde hair and blue eyes, and that's just the way it is. And you bring in this whole different angle, and we've explored this a little bit on the podcast, but I feel like you bring such a unique approach to it. So I was wondering if you could just talk to us more about that.
Yeah, I can. And I mean, it's funny because even I think in mainstream, just regular mainstream churches, it's like the language is still very much all masculine
Yeah.
in most churches today. And I definitely don't feel like I'm any sort of an expert at it at all because to me there was a time when when I had heard that phrase mother God and I was like, what? Like
Hmm.
just couldn't get on board. And it has been it has been a uh it has been a journey for me of people that I respect
Hmm.
opening the door to her and giving resources to me and reading. And in some ways it's also been, I just feel like I feel like she has called out to me to say, yeah, you need to be listening to the feminine spirit. And it's not in any way to delete the masculine, but there is something for me around bringing more of a balance, I think, to the language. And I think our language is so important around the divine, and to delete the feminine out of the equation and to never I mean, every once in a while you might get somebody say, well, God can be like a mother hen, and like
Hmm.
that might be all you receive, and there's so much there is so much wisdom, I think, that the feminine holds in the same way that the masculine holds all of this beautiful energy around a a structured approach and a way to be active. And also you need the organic flow.
Hmm.
And that's I feel like with creativity especially, it's like in order to really to invite creativity to really be a thread through your life, there has to be some structure. So that's the masculine energy, but there is also that invitation to organic flow. And when something comes your way that maybe you didn't expect or that you didn't want to happen, creativity, the feminine spirit says, okay, we're going to flow around that and we're going to find another way that we're going to keep going. And and there's just so much language metaphorically of the feminine. The womb space is such a beautiful metaphor for the divine journey of our lives.
Yeah.
And I mean, and Alexander John, going back to him, I mean, he talks about how everything it births from the darkness.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Mm.
so I just think that there's such an opportunity that we have to start really, if at all, to plant the seed for ourselves that God is not only masculine. And how could that even be anyways? Because everything is birthed from a mother. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. I mean, I remember having early on in my deconstruction, like having this conversation with somebody because I was really wrestling with God as the man, that I was raised with God being. And I'm like, I don't know if that's really if that's really the case, because I was like reading even like in the Bible where it talks of where Jesus says, God is like a mother hen and God is
yeah.
like a woman who's searching for a coin. I'm like, even
Oh,
Jesus is
yes.
using
Yes.
feminine language to refer to God. And I remember my evangelical friend saying, well, that's not what it means. I'm like, well, then tell me what it does mean, because Jesus is literally referring to God, who he calls his father, but he's referring to God as a woman. I said, there has to be something there. Then I came across, the book The Shack, and
Oh,
where
yeah.
it talks about,
Yes.
especially in the movie, which is very vivid, where sometimes God is this as a woman, sometimes God is a man. And I remember thinking to myself,
Yes.
man, like there's just times in my life where like you just need a divine mother whose lap you
Yes.
can crawl up onto and you can
Yes.
rest and fall asleep like I used to do with my mom or my grandma. But there's
Yeah.
other times where you need that divine father figure for whatever purpose, where you need that masculine
Yes.
energy. And what if God can just become whatever you need in the moment that you're in? And I feel like for me, like that's where I'm at now, is where God is just God. And sometimes God takes on the mental image of a woman, and sometimes God takes on the mental image of a man. Sometimes God just takes up the mental image of this wispy, this wispy
Yes.
spirit that's
Yes.
around me. It's like whatever I need in the moment, that's what God is. And I feel
Yes.
like I have such a deeper connection with that thinking of God as opposed to God is the male figure who I was raised with. So
I mean, you said it beautifully, and yes, I'm with you on that because I think that that's it. I think that I also just would say that there's there is, I think, both if you have, whether you have a father wound, a mother wound,
hmm.
whatever that is, I think, no human parent is perfect. None of us are perfect people. And there is something about a real gift of having the divine be a parental figure that can embrace us and that can receive us where we are and can hold us in the places that our parents maybe did not. And
Yeah.
so I just think that there's a real opening to that. And for people, I've heard, many people feel like, the father of grace is, the be all and end all. And I just thinking, where is that same grace for the mother? Where
Mm,
where is her space and place to be able to open her arms and to give the compassion that
that's right.
that she can give to all of us?
That's right. So
Yeah.
good. Allie, we are
Ah,
out of
thank
time,
you.
but
Thank you
this
so
has been
much.
a blast. Thank you for your work, for your book, and for making time for us.
Oh my gosh, it's been awesome. Thank you so much, Glenn. I really appreciate it.
Definitely. And real quick, where can people go if they want to connect with you, your artwork?
Yeah.
Where do you want to send us?
Uh, Go to my website, soulkindling.com. Same name as
The
my
title of
book.
the book, easy, easy
Yep,
peasy,
easy.
easy to remember. Awesome. I'll put the links in the show notes and we'll definitely do it again.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so
All
much.
right.